So, what motivates the terrorists? Why would someone walk into a nightclub and start shooting? Why would someone want to plant a homemade bomb at the finish line of one of the country's most prominent marathons? Why would someone want to plan and order an attack on the U.S., destroying the World Trade Centers, killing thousands of people? What motivates someone to do that? And there are many points of view. The psychological view, where criminologists say terrorists suffer from psychological deficits. They're emotionally disturbed, who act out his or her own psychosis within the confines of a violent group. The violence isn't driven by political agenda, but rather their emotional problems. However, there are many critical points that suggest that this isn't the case. Consider suicide bombers, a group that should be suffering from depression, typically found in people who take their own lives, but rather these folks willing to die for their cause show a sense of purpose and focus. And then there's the alienation view. Those who feel a lack of opportunity creates a sense of alienation that motivates them to embrace terrorism. Basically, they feel left out of the social and economic mainstream, i.e., the social problems cause them to join terror groups. But again, this isn't always the case. As explained in the example in the book, the expert who studies the Islamist groups, which is one type of terror group, not them all, he found that the members of that group were well educated, came from middle and upper class families, had families of their own. They were all in professions like doctors. Some say there's the family conflict view. Terrorists are the product of dysfunctional families. Because there's no father figure, one from a dysfunctional home might find a group with a strong leader to act as the substitute father and then adopt that group as a substitute family, kind of like gangs. The political view. When people are left out of the political process, they can't vote, or the right to vote is restricted. They're more inclined to join terror groups. Research has shown that dictatorship countries and countries that are full, on the other end, are full democracies, these types of countries experience less terrorist attacks than countries considered quote unquote the failed states, where the government has kind of lost control and they can't provide for their citizens, provide public services for their citizens. So it's these failed states that are the breeding grounds for terrorists, and the attacks that come in these countries are lethal. There seems to be, according to the experts, less frustration amongst individuals in full democracies, while on a dictatorship, while it works, history has shown that it's actually not a long-term prospect. So consider countries like Egypt, Libya, Syria. They were all run by dictators, but in the end, that did not work out well. So considering the political view, socialization and friendship view. Many terrorist recruits live in foreign countries. So they seek out people with similar backgrounds. They befriend them. And because maybe they share the same views and backgrounds, they might be roommates and move in together. And this creates a sense of solidarity. And they, in essence, stick together. So if one joins a terrorist group, the others might seem to follow. The ideological view. This is probably the most common. Terrorists hold extreme views and beliefs that prompt their behavior. Remember our discussion, the stages of a political criminal? It's similar. They start with a belief. There's this heightened perception of oppressive conditions, i.e. unjustly inflicted hardship on them. They are the victim because of their beliefs. They're convinced that the government won't help, and then they turn to violence to send a message or persuade a change. So how they do this is they create a divide. It's us against them. They're divided per the religion. They're divided per the ethnicity, racial, or other cultural criteria. So think about that. Does that sound like something that might be going on currently? A divide, us against them, left versus right, each referring to the other side as a terrorist. Think about that as you're looking through your social media feeds and are involved in the current political climate. Let's talk about state-sponsored terrorism. I've been touching on it right along. How can it be explained? This is government-backed terrorism, or even government-ordered terrorism, where they order the kill or the maiming of somebody. This is where the violent acts are not directed at a foreign government, but rather against natives of one's own country. Nazis didn't have trouble recruiting people to carry out the horrible acts during the Holocaust because many Germans wanted to be a part of the popular social/political movement and were indoctrinated by the Nazi propaganda. These people were willing to submit to authority. Russia ordered the control of Stalin, carried out similar acts against those who undermined the communist regime. How can we neutralize these acts? How can these acts be neutralized? What about backed government terrorism? During the early stages of the Iraq War, the United States Army and CIA personnel committed a series of human rights violations against detainees in a prison in Iraq, including physical and sexual abuse, torture, rape, sodomy, and murder. The abuses came to the public's attention when the publication of photographs of the abuse by CBS News in April 2004. The incidents received widespread news in both the U.S. and the abroad. We looked very down upon. The administration of George Bush asserted that the abuses were isolated incidences and were not indicative of U.S. policy. This assertion, however, was disputed by humanitarian organizations such as the Red Cross, Amnesty International, and Human Rights Watch. These organizations stated that the abuse at the prisons were part of a wider pattern of torture and brutal treatment at American overseas detention centers, including in Iraq and Afghanistan. So, foreign countries and Middle Eastern countries or countries with uprising is not the only country that seems to be involved with state-sponsored terrorism. Consider that example. And I remember when all that came out, you can Google it and see the story, and you can see the horrible pictures, if you want, that came out of it. International intervention isn't helpful because it comes from the fact that, like, the deed is already done. Like that example above, it was done, and it came to light by the media, and then the human rights organizations find the U.S. and claim they violated the laws that were in place. So instead, experts suggest preventative strategies like international aid and economic development by the industrial nations to those in third world countries that are collapsing, or help them create a social welfare system. Getting involved at that level so we don't get to the point where terrorism is happening in these failed states, so to speak. The extent of terrorism. So what is the extent of the threat of terrorism? Will it go away? Not likely. Actually, and sadly, it appears to be growing and becoming more violent. The National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, START. Between 2002 and 2015, the Islamic State carried out more than 41,000 attacks and caused 33,000 deaths. Asia and Africa are the locations that are mostly attacked. And there's a list of some of the more active groups: Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Islamic State. The other two are out of Africa, I believe, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. And in the U.S., between 93 Between 1993 and 2016, there were 109 terror plots, 70 foiled by law enforcement. Most of the perpetrators were U.S. citizens or residents. That's 75% of those. Private citizens and property were the common targets, with 20% of that number, followed by military institutions, aircraft, and other government targets. And then from there, it was transportation and business targets. So response, well, we have the criminal justice response. No surprise that after 9/11, U.S. agencies began focusing their attention on combating terrorism. Not just the federal government, but all the way down to local law enforcement agencies have some sort of terrorist plan in place. The 9/11 Commission was formed and was tasked with investigating the events of 9/11 and create a plan to ensure that no further attacks like that would occur. In response to the report, the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI, was created and charged with coordinating data from the nation's primary intelligence gathering agencies. The DNI serves as the intelligence advisor and advises the president. In May of 2020, the sixth Director of National Intelligence was appointed, John Ratcliffe. So who reports to the director? The National Counterterrorism Center, which is made up of the FBI, CIA, Pentagon, Civil Liberties Board, and the National Proliferation Center. The NCTC is the primary organization in the U.S. government for analyzing and integrating all intelligence possessed and acquired by the government pertaining to terrorism and counterterrorism. Back to the Commission's report, they also noted the things that need to be done and need to be put in place, and agencies and law enforcement took action. They took action, like I said, on every level, federal, state, and local levels. So how are we combating terrorism? Well, let's talk about federal law enforcement. And this is very general. We have the FBI. They made it their number one priority after 9/11 to crack down on terrorism. It now coordinates intelligence collections with Border Patrol, Secret Service, and CIA. It has created Joint Terrorist Task Force, 103 of them throughout the country, which are made up of various members of law enforcement, federal agencies, and military forces. And these task forces make it possible to share information and intelligence across the many groups and organizations and agencies. That was one of the problems with 9/11, is nobody could communicate with each other in the different groups. Firefighters couldn't communicate with the police couldn't communicate, the local New York City police couldn't communicate with the FBI, and so forth. So there was like a disconnect of what was going on. So now that is in place. Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11, and it was tasked with preventing terrorist attacks within the U.S., reducing vulnerability to terrorism, reducing the country's vulnerability to terrorism, and minimizing the damage and recovering from any attacks that do occur. And the Department of Homeland Security wasn't like created from the ground up. It was made from combining efforts that have already existed in other agencies. So it is tasked with a number of things: border and transportation security, so what comes in, what comes out of the U.S., emergency preparedness and response, so they aid Americans' recovery if there is an attack. They are preparing and responding to threats involving weapons of mass destruction and prevent nuclear weapons and materials from being imported. They also collect information and analyze the information and infrastructure protections. They assess the danger facing the nation after collecting and analyzing data from multiple sources. At our state and county law enforcement levels, they're also connected now to the FBI and Department of Homeland Security, all states and counties implemented measures to combat terrorism, including participating in the task force that the FBI has created, as I said. They also team up with community organizations, community members, and crime watch programs. In a lot of the big cities, some plots were foiled just by a innocent bystander noticing something out of the ordinary and calling the police. That has happened more than one occasion. Local law enforcement, especially major cities like New York City, have implemented programs and plans and task force together with state agencies and law enforcement and the federal organizations. The New York City has its own counterterrorism bureau. The group is trained to examine potential targets in the city and to insulate them from being attacked. In 2015, New York City also created a strategic response group, and these are more, military trained. They're trained on counterterrorism, and they're equipped with fighting gear, heavy gear, machinery, in the event of combat. So we combating terrorism through the law, except some law has been challenged. After 9/11, the U.S. government went full force after those responsible for the attack. They went head on. Congress authorized President Bush to, quote unquote, use all necessary and appropriate force. And that he did, as well as trounced on constitutional protections that are afforded not only American citizens, but those individuals on U.S. soil and under U.S. custody. The Constitution applies to everybody in those terms: citizens, those on our soil, and those in our custody are entitled to our protections of the Constitution. The Supreme Court heard several cases involving individuals identified as terrorists by the government, and at that time, being identified a terrorist just means having a last name that has its origination from a Middle Eastern country or a country from one of the individuals who were responsible for 9/11. That's how much of a stretch our government pulled that. And in the case of Hamandi versus Rumsfeld, the Supreme Court, this is the first case the Supreme Court heard. The Supreme Court said that you cannot hold somebody who is actually a U.S. citizen, detain them, without providing them with the charges that you're holding them for and allowing him or her to challenge that confinement. This all violates the due process of our Constitution. Due process, if you remember, fair process in the criminal justice system. So holding an American citizen who is accused of, in that case, aiding the Taliban, needed to give them the charges and let them basically have a trial, go through the court process, not just hold them. That's what they were doing. They were detaining these people outside, in prisons outside the U.S. territory, by the way. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. And then we had Rasool versus Bush. The Supreme Court said that, yes, the Supreme Court can hear challenges to someone's confinement. That's the habeas corpus word that you see in the book. Habeas corpus means challenges to confinements. It's what the person's looking for, the court to order to allow the case to be heard. So the Supreme Court said that, yeah, federal courts can hear from foreign individuals held outside of the U.S. by the U.S. So now we have someone who's being held by the U.S. government, but not on our soil, but they're under our control, and they're not a citizen. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, our Constitution applies to people in our custody, regardless of where you're holding them. The Supreme Court again ruled against the government in holding that they cannot have a trial on someone before a military court without naming them as an unlawful enemy combatant. So you can't just bring people through the military court process, which is the one that hears these kinds of cases, without deeming them as somebody who is against the United States, unlawful enemy combatant. So after that, after the third loss, the government thought they'd smarten up, and they passed a law that stripped the federal courts of jurisdiction to hear cases from those who were detained who have been deemed, quote unquote, enemy combatants. These are our suspected terrorists. And these are the ones that they deemed who is unknown. You don't know what they're deemed by who deems them is unknown. Is it the president? Is it some general? Who deems them an enemy combatant? Because at the time, anyone, like I said, could be a suspect to terrorism that the government thought was a suspect. So the government passed the law saying, yeah, no more federal courts. You can't hear cases from the detainees. And guess what? Somebody challenged that law, and the Supreme Court said, yeah, no, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional too. You can't strip the judicial process. So the government was really cracking down on terrorism. And then the U.S. Patriot Act was passed. I described that at the beginning of the discussion. It was passed October 26, 2001, 6 weeks after 9/11. Legislation, basically it was legislation giving the U.S. law enforcement agencies a free hand to investigate and apprehend suspected terrorists. And when I say free hand, they got a lot of stuff that would normally require a warrant. They expanded all 4 traditional tools of surveillance, like wiretapping, search warrants, pen and trap orders. Those are recording phone calls. Subpoenas. They made the ability much, much easier. In some cases, they didn't even need a warrant. They could just do it. And, by expanding, as I was saying, meaning they didn't need to get a warrant. They could just go and do it for anyone that they suspected of terrorism. This also expanded to the internet. They can monitor emails, electronic communications, websites, all without a court order. Additionally, they were able to collect data from some of the biggest cell phone companies, numbers, dates, times, durations of calls. They couldn't get voicemails. They used to be able to ask internet service providers for personal information, but that component was challenged in court, and the court shot it down. Under the Patriots Act, the government had a lot of unrestricted power, all in the name of national security. The Patriots Act ended in 2015, and it was replaced by the Freedom Act. And the Freedom Act prevented, the big one was it prevented the National Security Agency, the NSA, that's who Edward Snowden worked for, from continuing its mass phone data collection program. That was the biggest change, now that they do actually require a warrant. But a lot of the other things that I've said are still in place under the U.S. Freedom Act. Combating terrorists with politics. Some say fighting terrorists is not the solution. No matter how many are captured or killed, more are ready to take over. And that seems to be the pattern, and they're getting a lot more lethal. According to nonprofit organization, the RAND Corp, steps to defeat jihadist groups include attack the ideological underpinnings of global jihadism. Sever it and the other links between the terrorist groups, strengthen the capabilities of frontline states to counter the local jihadist threats. This works, according to RAND, because the larger group, RAND Corp says, the larger groups of Muslims don't actually ascribe to the Al-Qaeda goal of overturning Muslim country governments. In doing so, support, if these things are in place, in doing so, support for Al-Qaeda may begin to topple them and do away with them. So we will see where this goes, but right now terrorism is on the rise, and it looks like it'll be around for years to come. It has been around since the early since the French Revolution. So anyhow, that completes this chapter, political crimes. Next week, we are going to turn to the economic crimes.